Republican presidential hopeful Marco Rubio pushing a tax reform plan that includes lowering the corporate tax rate to 25% and allowing full expensing for capital purchases rather than depreciation. What will that do for the economy? I'm joined now by Harry Stein. He's Director of Fiscal Policy at the Center for American Progress Action Fund. Thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you for having me.
So let's start with just a basic question. Would the Rubio plan to cut taxes spur economic growth?
Well, that hasn't been the historical experience. We always hear these promises that big tax cuts at the top, cutting tax rates on investment income, as you were talking about, cutting corporate tax rates, will be a huge engine of economic growth. But that just hasn't been borne out by the experience. When you study either in the US or internationally, we just don't see any correlation in the data for something that ought to be such a powerful engine of economic growth, and it's just totally invisible.
What about this idea being kicked around about expensing capital purchases rather than depreciation, which takes years to do? Wouldn't that essentially lower corporate taxes even further?
It would, and this is a really important point. A lot of times you hear the concept of what we base broadening and rate lowering tax reform. So we're going to get rid of tax breaks and then use that money to lower the corporate tax rate. And there's good ways of doing that, but it's important to note that what Rubio's talking about is lowering the corporate tax rate, and then he's mainly talking about ideas to further narrow the corporate tax base, as you say, full expensing being a big expansion of corporate tax breaks that already exist for accelerated depreciation. So it's not at all clear that he even intends to pay for his rate reduction. So I wouldn't say his plan is corporate tax reform so much as just a giant corporate tax cut.
I guess the other interesting idea is, how do you quantify? Is there a way to quantify what monies potentially are lost to Treasury when tax rates are cut?
Sure. So there's been different estimates of his plan, and his plan's evolved a little bit over time. But we've heard numbers around $4 trillion in the first 10 years alone. And I think that that's really the most important thing to keep in mind with this plan, is just how completely divorced it is from any sense of fiscal reality, when we're really going to need more revenue over time, not less, as the population ages, if we still want Social Security and Medicare. You know, I think Josh Barro of the New York Times said it best. He called Marco Rubio's plan the puppies and rainbows plan, because he's really just trying to kind of give something to everyone. And the way that he does that is by just ignoring any sense of fiscal reality.
What about on the individual side, the idea of consolidating income tax brackets? There's been a lot of talk for years that the tax code is very complicated. Does that negatively impact revenue raising, or does it make sense just on the individual side?
It depends how you consolidate the rates, but I think the most important point to keep in mind is that less tax brackets does not make doing your taxes any simpler. Now, step back and think about this. You're doing your taxes, and it's hard to figure out all the income and all the deductions and figure all that out. And then you arrive at taxable income. And then either if you're using software, the software just does the math for you, or if you're doing it by hand, you just go to the tax tables and look it up. But no one actually has to do that calculation. So it's no simpler to do your taxes whether you have 2 brackets or 7 brackets. What it does do, by making the tax code less progressive when you collapse the rate structure, is a lot of times it means that the rich come out ahead because you're lowering the top rate at the expense of low and middle income people. So in Rubio's case, he has the 35% rate kicking in at just $75,000 for somebody who's single, where right now that rate kicks in at closer to $300,000 or $400,000.
Based on what we know with these plans, what would the economy look like under a Rubio administration if he were to be elected and all this was passed without resistance?
Sure. So I think if you saw any tax plan, that large, the closest analog that we have is the Bush tax cuts, which weren't nearly as large as what Rubio is contemplating, but which were quite large. We had an incredibly anemic period of economic growth, so a very, very kind of tepid period compared to previous expansions, followed by the massive collapse of the Great Recession, which made it look like a lot of the growth that we were seeing was actually driven by a housing bubble. So I think you wouldn't see the economic growth that we were promised. What you would see is massive, massive deficits, and then suddenly this manufactured crisis that Rubio's tax cuts would create that would force huge cuts to Medicare and Medicaid, Social Security, education, and infrastructure. So I think what you'd see is an economy that's anemic, that only works for people at the top, even more so than the kinds of problems that we're seeing today.
Harry Stein, thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you.
I'm Rhonda Schaffler for The Street.